A nonprofit research group has pulled together statistics indicating that the death penalty in most cases is symbolic and can be used to coerce false confessions. Governor Susana Martinez said in her State of the State address that she would like to reinstate the death penalty that former Governor Bill Richardson had repealed in March of 2009. Richard Dieter from the Death Penalty Information Center says that New Mexico's use of the death penalty in the past has been more symbolic than real.
The death penalty has produced one execution in New Mexico in about 40 years, so really isn't practiced even when it was on the books. I think there were 2 people on death row when the death penalty was abolished. So I think it has been symbolic rather than actual, and therefore the purposes of the death penalty, which are sometimes referred to as deterrence or retribution, aren't meaningful with that kind of a law, and that was actually the practice for many years in New Mexico. So, it is still it's a costly practice because of course lots of trials are happening or potential and have to have attorneys assigned and prosecutors assigned. So it's expensive, even though it has produced virtually nothing in the state.
Thomas Gladish, Richard Greer, Ronald Klein, and Clarence Smith were all released from death row in New Mexico after being found innocent. There's been 138 exonerations in 26 different states nationally. Does having the death penalty deter crime? Dieter says that with the infrequency of it being used, it's not a deterrence.
The problem is that even in the rest of the country, there are relatively few executions. So, last year there were 46 executions in the whole country. There were roughly 14,000 murders. So, there's no sense that a murder produces an execution. And that's the theory behind deterrence. But it's used so rarely and so far in the distance from when the murder occurred that the best people say is that maybe it could be a deterrent if it were used frequently, swiftly, and surely, but that with so many of the executions being in just one state, Texas, and so many being in the South, 80% of executions are in the South, it's hard to make a conclusion nationally about whether an execution helps prevent a murder. There's just not a good connection between the two. It's not like everybody who commits murder faces the death penalty. It's just much rarer than that. So I don't think that's a strong rationale for having the death penalty. If a criminal thinks about all of that, which is unlikely, but if they do, they would probably conclude the odds are against them ever being executed.
Is there the possibility that the threat of execution could induce a false confession in a suspect that is told that the death penalty might be taken off the table if they cooperate? Have there been any cases of that?
Oh, yes. This is a definite problem. Matter of fact, many prosecutors will say they want the death penalty as a tool, not so much to get executions, but to get those plea bargains, because you're holding over the defendant a threat of death, and sometimes people will confess to things they didn't do, and there's that danger. Some cases in Nebraska, about 4 people were released about 2 years ago who had confessed, but they were threatened with the death penalty, and that's why they confessed, and it turns out they didn't do it. And so, this is an ongoing problem, and one of the reasons why even having the death penalty as a tool or as a incentive to get life sentences is dangerous. I think it's also unethical, and to threaten. It's sort of like what a terrorist might do. We'll kill you if you don't do something. Follow our way or whatever. We don't want to threaten people with their death if they don't speak and cooperate and confess. That it's just too dangerous. It takes away your right to a trial, etc. So that's another lurking possibility with the death penalty. If you get a life sentence, fortunately, you can still have a chance to be exonerated. But if you take the chance, you roll the dice and say, I'm not confessing to something I didn't do, and get the death penalty and then possibly be executed, nothing can be be undone. So it has a problem either way it's used.
Governor Martinez says certain crimes deserve the death penalty, such as the murder of a child or a police officer. Can its use be restricted to just these crimes?
They could restrict the death penalty to, say, only if it's murder, serial murder, or murder of a police officer. The trouble is that those tend to be the first draft of the death penalty law, and then it tends to get expanded. Rarely does it ever get restricted. So first time a firefighter or teacher or child get murdered, there's a sense of, well, why shouldn't the death penalty apply there also? And so most states have a sort of an expanded list. It's very difficult to keep it narrow, to say this life is worth more than other lives. So you could have a law that was very restrictive, but don't see that in the death penalty laws across the country.
Dieter says the law can be biased and arbitrary.
First problem is this race of the victim, which is not in the law but is in the practice. And there's been quite a few studies in many states over the years, and it's about 3 to 4 times more likely that you will get the death penalty if you killed a white person than if you killed a minority person.
How is it decided who gets the death penalty and who doesn't?
Well, it's a individual choice. I mean, some prosecutors just don't believe in seeking it, and some believe in seeking it nearly all the time. In Arizona, they had a prosecutor in Maricopa County had 100 death penalty cases going at one time. And then you go to some other county, and they don't have any, even though they have murder. So it's partly up to the beliefs. And then you get into the budget. Some counties have, it's going to cost $1 million or more to try and fully prosecute a death penalty case. $3 million by the time it's over, by best estimates. So if a county has a budget crisis or only has a budget of $1 million, seeking the death penalty can be a financial decision, and so that enters into it too. And then you get the intangibles of generally district attorneys or elected officials in a case of high-profile public outrage. That might be a death penalty case, but a murder from a poor part of town, which there was not much mention in the media, or the death penalty won't be sought. So there's a lot of factors, and what happens is the death penalty is not applied uniformly, even within a state.
What's the difference in cost between having somebody on death row who's to be executed and having somebody life without parole?
The difference is in getting the person there. The trial of a death penalty case is almost always 2 lawyers assigned, 2 prosecutors assigned, maybe more, and 2 trials, really. 1 trial to determine guilt and 1 trial to determine the sentence. The latter days of New Mexico, even a separate jury. So typically a criminal case is relatively short, perhaps a plea bargain, but death penalty cases are almost always a trial followed by a second. It adds up to about $3 million for a death penalty case through the whole process, about $1 million for a life sentence individual.
Richard Dieter from the Death Penalty Information Center.
We should also send a message that some crimes deserve the ultimate punishment. When a monster rapes and murders a child, or a criminal kills a police officer, the death penalty should be an option for the jury. That's why I am calling on the legislature to repeal the repeal and reinstate the death penalty.
For KSFR News, I'm Rachel Kennedy.